If someone writes a U.S. history book and doesn't include the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, is that automatically an unreliable U.S. history book?
Not necessarily.
Good.
If it claims to be a comprehensive U.S. history book, then certainly it's unreliable.
Okay. Whenever I read any document that claims to be historically accurate, I'm a skeptic, but not a cynic. And so I look for contradictions within this historical record. If the contradictions exist, my skepticism rises. If there's an internal consistency, I begin to trust the document a little bit more. Second test, literary style. Is the literary style of the document, once upon a time in the land of Nod, Wynken, Blynken, and Odd took a boat ride? That's not historical narrative. That's fairy tale. So if it's fairy tale, as a literary style, I'm not going to trust it to give me accurate historical information. When you read the Gospels, you'll notice the literary style is historical narrative. At this time, in this place, with these people around, Jesus said this, he did that. Third test, archaeology. Was Jesus born on the island of Atlantis? If he was, I got a problem with the text, because archaeology does not verify the existence of the island of Atlantis. But in reality, Jesus was born, according to the Gospels, in Bethlehem, archaeologically verifiable. Fourth test. How do we know that we have what those guys wrote nearly 2,000 years ago? Have you ever played the game telephone? You sit in a circle, you whisper a secret into the ear of the person next to them, they whisper it into the ear of the person next to them, and by the time the secret reaches the end of the circle, it's totally perverted. Yes, I have played that game. No, that is not how we have the Gospels handed down to us. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that we have today are right from the original Greek, which is the language they were written in. We have over 5,200 Greek manuscripts or pieces of manuscript, all agreeing to a very precise detail. So the manuscript evidence for the veracity of the Gospels historically is overwhelming. So I just read the Gospels as history, and that's what I ask all you to do. Read the Gospels as history and ask yourself, does the historical evidence of the way Jesus lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead point to his credibility or not?
On the subject of internal consistency, the Bible isn't actually all that great at that. I could give you some examples if you like.
Yeah, let's stick with the Gospels, okay?
All right. So here's the story of the birth of Jesus. You mentioned that yourself. How he was born in Bethlehem. If we go to the Gospels to look at this, to see what the Gospels have to say about the birth of Jesus, only 2 of the Gospels actually say anything about it. The rest of them pick up as he is an adult.
Yep.
And the 2 stories given are incompatible. In one story, Jesus is born, and then Herod, who has been given warning of this event, he decides to massacre the children. And to avoid this, Jesus and his mother flee to Egypt, and then later they go to Nazareth. But in the other one, Jesus is born, and then they stay there for 40 days to, there's some event, I think, that they're staying for, and then they go to Nazareth. So we see an inconsistency.
Okay. What do you think history is? Do you think there's any book on any portion of history that includes every detail of what happened?
No.
Good. So you agree with me that history is a selective account of what happened?
Yes.
Okay. That's what you have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You have 4 independent accounts that are selective accounts of what happened. It's like this. You and I are standing down on Guadalupe. We see 2 cars coming down the road. We hear a screech of brakes. We hear a woman scream, and then there's a collision. You and I go to the police department. You say, officer, I saw the 2 cars coming down the street. I heard a screech of brakes. There was a collision. I say, officer, I saw the 2 cars coming down the street. I heard a woman scream, and there was a collision. Are you and I contradicting each other?
No.
Thank you. We're offering 2 equally valid perspectives on what really happened. Just because one gospel talks about the trip to Egypt and the other is silent about the trip to Egypt, there is no contradiction between a statement in one book and silence in another. A contradiction would be, they went to Egypt, they never went to Egypt. Then we would have a problem.
But that the massacre that Herod committed
Yes.
and the subsequent move to Egypt
Yes?
is a highly significant event
Really?
in the context of this story they're telling about the birth of Jesus.
Of what significance to your life and my life today is it that Herod slaughtered a bunch of babies in Bethlehem?
Well, the problem here isn't the significance to our life today, but the significance to the story of Jesus. And on that point, it's actually fairly significant.
Please explain why.
Well, because they're trying to tell the story of the birth of Jesus, right? And in one story, there's this guy who wants to kill Jesus, so they have to run away to Egypt. And then in the other story, they never say anything about this guy, and they never say anything about going to Egypt.
If Jesus is God in human form, come to save you and me from despair, guilt, death, and hell, of what significance is it that Herod killed a bunch of people in Bethlehem?
Okay, so apparently me and you have different views on the subject of the importance of this particular subject.
Well, I have not heard from you an explanation of why it is so significant that Herod killed a bunch of babies in Bethlehem.
Because he was trying to kill Jesus.
Yeah, and he didn't succeed. He didn't succeed. Sir, do you know how many Jews were killed by Romans at that time? The Romans were barbaric people. The Romans slaughtered many Jews all the time. In fact, the Romans nailed Jews to crosses on a real regular basis. Just because the Gospels don't record all of that doesn't mean they're unreliable, because they didn't record that. See, history, sir, is a selective account of what happened. If someone writes a U.S. history book and doesn't include the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, is that automatically an unreliable U.S. history book?
Not necessarily.
Good.
If it claims to be a comprehensive U.S. history book, then certainly it's unreliable.
Okay. All right.
But that's not the only subject on which there is an inconsistency. Would you agree to me that Jesus' most important sermon is a significant event in his life, which any writer of the story of Jesus as the Son of God would want to include in their tale?
I can promise you, sir, we do not have a precise record of the most important sermon that Jesus taught.
Have you ever heard of the Sermon of the Mount? Sermon on... All right.
Yes.
That only appears in one of the Gospels. That's only in one of the Gospels. There's another sermon which is very similar in time and content in another of the Gospels, but that is delivered on the plains.
Yeah.
And then neither of the other two Gospels mention anything about it, and John the Baptist seemed to be unaware of it.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea how many years I have spoken in Austin?
No.
Good. Because it's been a lot. And I can promise you, over the past 20 years of speaking on this fine campus, I have repeated myself, I have said different things, and if someone were to write a record of what I've said out on this West Mall, it would be very different from what someone else would record, because I've said a lot, I've repeated myself, I've done some really unique things that I regret, that I'm not going to repeat. So, you're grappling with, what does it mean to give a record? And the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 is not a claim that Jesus gave this thing all from beginning to end, and this was it. That Sermon on the Mount has a lot of different sayings that Jesus undoubtedly said not just once, not just on a mount, not just on a plain, sir, but a lot of other times. That's why the oral tradition was so strong, because Jesus repeated himself. and repeated himself. He spoke in parables. I hope you don't think he gave the parable of the Good Samaritan just once.
No.
Good. So if one gospel writer were to record that Jesus gave the parable of the Good Samaritan on a mountaintop, and another would say he gave the parable of the Good Samaritan in a boat on the Sea of Galilee. Sir, that's not a contradiction. The same way that if someone records that Cliffe said this in one place, and he said the same thing in another place, that's not a contradiction, sir. It's not a problem. Right?
All right.
Okay, but let me make one quick more comment. You see, sir, I am very, very frustrated with the dishonesty of some, not all, some religion professors who critique the New Testament by doing exactly what you've just been doing. What I mean is, it is intellectually dishonest to have such a precise requirement that everything line up perfectly. And if everything doesn't line up perfectly, it's obviously erroneous. See, that's intellectually dishonest. Why? Because if you go to any other document and you apply the same stringent test to that other document that these religion professors are applying to the New Testament, you'd blow that book right out of the water. See, so the lack of ability to be consistent in those stringent textual criticism, that really disturbs me. I don't think it's intellectually honest.
All right.
Does that make any sense?
Yes. All right. So I'll waive the internal consistency bit for now.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you and I respect you. You need to hear me, okay?
Okay.
Sometimes talking to people, I feel like, man, they're not listening to me and we're not getting anywhere. But I really appreciate that.
All right.
Respect you.
So there was internal consistency, writing
Literary style,
historical evidence, and
No. Internal consistency, literary style,
archaeological evidence, and
manuscript.
And manuscript
Yes,
evidence.
sir.
Yes. Isn't literary style more a function of how it is how it is chosen to be written than any truth or falsehood of the tale?
Yeah.
All right.
Yes. But then it shows intent, right? If I say to you, once upon a time, and then I say to you, yesterday I was out here speaking on this West Mall.
Yes.
Those are two different claims. I better be honest in the intent that I'm communicating to you. You know, once upon a time, I'm not implying that this really happened. But if I say to you, yesterday, Tuesday, November 17th, I was standing out here, and this is what I said. You better take that differently than when I say, well, you know, once upon a time, Hansel and Gretel went up a hill to fetch a pail of water.
Yes. So, but it doesn't change any of the content. It's just a matter of intent, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, if my intent is to communicate to you truth about where I was yesterday, then I use a style that says, at this time in this place, this is where I was. If I say once upon a time, I'm not communicating specificity, I'm not communicating an accurate event.
Right. But the Bible has been translated many times, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and a lot of this translation was done by people who had an intent about the story, right? Mm-hmm. That, like, have you ever, the Council of Nicaea, I think, that there was a few people who specifically chose books, like books that had been written about Jesus, and took these together and said, this is the New Testament of the Bible. All right? So if you have a number of documents, and you want to choose, and they certainly had an agenda. They certainly believed that Jesus was God. So the ones that they choose would be the ones whose intent matched their own intent, wouldn't it?
Okay, great point. Dan Brown, in the Da Vinci Code, got a few things mixed up. The Council of Nicaea, sir, did not determine the New Testament. The Council of Nicaea struggled through the identity of Christ. How was the New Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament, put together? It was put together over a long period of time by the eyewitnesses, by those who knew the eyewitnesses, by those who knew them. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were accepted as authoritative right in the first century. They were read as authoritative. So were Paul's writings in the second century. Hebrews, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, lots of questions, into the 200s even. It was two councils at the end of the 4th century, in 393 and 397 AD, the Council of Hippo Regius and the Council of Carthage, that finally put their stamp of approval on what had already been decided. These 27 New Testament books are the New Testament canon.
All right,
So the Council of
thank you for
Nicaea
the
had
correction. I must have mixed up some things I read.
It's all right, don't worry, man.
So it's I'm having a hard time deciding how to put this.
Just put it out there.
Certainly there's a lot of... All right, have you ever heard of the story of George Washington cutting down the cherry tree?
Yeah.
All right. That never happened. That's not an actual thing that George Washington did.
Good. How do you know that?
Well, we know that because we know exactly who made it up. We know that there was a person who admired George Washington and wanted George Washington thought of as a great person, and he created this story.
Good.
And this happened 200 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And it's, something we've all heard and something we've all thought about. So this intentional creation of something that didn't happen to aggrandize a person,
Uh-huh.
we have records of this happening, like, all the time. So what makes you think that didn't happen to Jesus? That's...
Because the same tools that we use to determine George Washington did not cut down the cherry tree, we use to determine, did Jesus really live or not? What did he do when he was alive? Did he die on a cross? Did he rise from the dead or not? It's a study of history, which is a great study. And I love the certainty that you exhibited when you said, and we know that George Washington did not cut down the cherry tree. Why? Because we study history. And the historical record does not include that. That is a bit of folklore that grew up around George Washington. And guess what? We know the same thing about Jesus when it comes to the Gnostic Gospels. We've got Jesus in the Gnostic Gospels killing a playmate, then raising him back to life. We've got Jesus making some clay pigeons and turning them into real birds. And we know from the historical record in the first century, no, these are legends, folklore that grew up. We know Siddhartha Gautama Buddha did not believe in God. Well, you go into the homes of a lot of Buddhists, and they're worshiping gods. Well, that's not what Siddhartha Gautama Buddha taught. Siddhartha Gautama Buddha was agnostic, didn't believe in God. Well, how do we know that? By studying the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama Buddha. That's how we know that. So, we have ways called historical critical thinking of ascertaining what did Jesus really do, what did he really say, how did he die, how did he rise from the dead. That's how we do that and determine that.
Okay, so you're talking about Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, right?
Yeah.
All right. So, by the same standards that we know Jesus died and rose from the dead, we know Siddhartha Gautama Buddha achieved nirvana.
No. We don't know he achieved nirvana. But we know that he lived and that's what he taught.
All right. So we know that there is, that it is said that Jesus died and rose from the dead.
Well, eyewitnesses saw the man die on a cross. Eyewitnesses saw his body taken off the cross and put in a very, very public tomb, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who was a very well-known politician of the day. He was a ruler in Jerusalem. So this was not a secret little tomb somewhere. This was very well-known, tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. A stone was rolled in front, a Roman guard was set. So we know that this happened.
Is this mentioned anywhere outside of the Bible?
Yes. Josephus, the Jewish historian, talks about Jesus dying on a cross and supposedly rising from the dead, and that was what was taught.
Does he say that was what supposedly happened?
No, he's pretty direct. He says, you know, the guy rose from the dead. And the question is, well, then why wasn't Josephus a follower of Christ? So it's a hard question when it comes to what was going on there with Josephus. But I mean, he writes about it, about
Isn't
Jesus as an historical person. The letters of Paul were written between 48, 9, and 60 AD. So you've got Paul writing 1 Corinthians 15, where he writes that Jesus, well, he writes, what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised to life on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Peter, James, the other apostles, and then he appeared to over 500 people who saw him risen from the dead. So Paul is writing this in about 50, 51, 52 AD, 20 years after the fact. The gap between 1 Corinthians 15 and the events of Jesus' death and resurrection is about 20 years at the most.